John Jackson, I'll be your moderator for the afternoon. When I was contacted to participate in this event, I told the organizers that I'd feel very much at home because I grew up in libraries. My mother was a librarian at different times, working in the parish libraries of Portland, Westmoreland, where she met my father, and St. Thomas, which is where I grew up. My holiday jobs were all in the library, and at school, I was in the library club. So you can see I'm an out-and-out nerd through and through. That's okay, I've accepted that, I'm good with that. And in fact, what it did was give me a lifelong respect for the importance of libraries in our national life, in our societies. Even more so the National Library, which is really one of our keepers of our heritage, keepers of our culture. My friends at The Observer in an editorial last year wrote that although most Jamaicans can be forgiven for not knowing much about the National Library, in fact, it's a critical defender of Jamaica's intellectual and cultural lifeblood. Established in 1979, the National Library is now celebrating 40 years of existence, and this distinguished lecture is one of the several events being planned to commemorate that. Now, one of the things that the organizers are aiming to do over this period of time is to expose more Jamaicans to the treasures that lie within the walls of the National Library and how to access them, and you'll be hearing more about that, I'm sure. Before we get on with the function in earnest, just a couple of housekeeping matters. There is Wi-Fi. If you log on, you will see Knutsford Court Function Room. The username and password are both library with a capital L. Having got onto Wi-Fi, apart from tweeting and doing whatever other social media activities you do, your participation this afternoon will be facilitated through a technological platform called Slido. So we're inviting you to log on to slido.com, and I think the instructions will be put up on the screen at some point, slido.com. You'll be asked to input a code. The code will be NL for National Library, J, National Library of Jamaica, NLJ, lecture. Once you input that code, then a screen will come up on which you can type in a question. So you don't have to hold your questions until the end. As they come to you, you can just type them in. You'll have the option of sharing your name or not. And when it's time, we'll be taking as many of your questions, in fact, as we can. And now, on with this wonderful afternoon of activities we have for you. I'll be asking the board member of the National Library of Jamaica, Canon Michael Allen, to begin by leading us in prayer, following which the National Librarian, Beverly Lashley, will say a few words as well.
Let us pray. Lord God, we have gathered together in the unity of the Spirit as the National Library and Friends to celebrate this biblical achievement of 40 years. We pray that in the same way, the 40 years of Moses and the people of Israel in the wilderness was used to shape them for the pivotal task of leadership and nationhood. So may our 40 years shape us as the preservers of the nation's heritage for leadership and service in the discussion of our past and the shaping of our future. As we facilitate the telling of our story, the Jamaican story, in a way that gives our people hope for the future and pride about our past in all its dimensions. Enable us by the presentation by Professor Thomas in this distinguished lecture and our panelists to so explore our history, our story, that we be inspired to remember and never to forget the price of our freedom and the way that you, Lord God, and your Son Christ Jesus have kept us going so that justice and truth will be ours forever in this Jamaica land we love. We ask this in the name of our Redeemer and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I want to first of all thank you all for coming. I'd like to acknowledge, of course, our distinguished lecturer, Deborah Thomas, Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. Of course, we have Mr. Vivian Crawford, the Executive Director of the Institute of Jamaica, who is actually representing Minister Grange, who is unavoidably absent. Mr. Crawford is also a board member. I'm seeing another board member in our audience, Dr. Paulette Carr, who is a campus librarian. I'd like to recognize as well our panelists. We have Major General Anthony Anderson, Commissioner of Police, Ms. Paula Willing, Director of Public Prosecution, Reverend Dr. Levon Dick, Pastor of the Boulevard Baptist Church. Our board chair also should have been with us, but unfortunately she's ill, so she's not here with us today. I note that there's a lot of librarians and colleagues, library colleagues in the audience as well, and I'd like to recognize Mrs. Winston Hudson, our former National Librarian. Mrs. Hudson has held the National Library flag very high for 14 years, and she's actually the conceptualizer of this distinguished lecture series. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, everyone. It is really an honor to begin the conversation on the National Library's 40th anniversary celebrations with this distinguished lecture, Memory, Archive, and the Price of Forgiving. This is a pre-celebration event, and the second event will be the staging of the World Poetry Day, which is on March 21. And last year, we had our diplomatic corps. They were speaking red poetry actually in their native tongue to the delight of the audience, and that was really a major hit, as well as the inclusion of the Helen Zell Young Writers Prize for Poetry, which was actually conceptualized by our poet laureate of Jamaica, Lorna Goodis. So I want you all to mark the date, World Poetry Day, March 21. It's right here at Metso Court Hotel, and we begin at 10 o'clock. But 2019 is really a very special year for the National Library of Jamaica, as we celebrate proudly with our fellow Jamaican brothers, sisters, and friends 40 years of sterling service to the cultural development of Jamaica. So in fact, we started in 1979. We were established under the Institute of Jamaica. Mr. Crawford is here with us, and he can share the history of the collection which started out at the West India Reference Library, which was actually founded from in 1894. Now, Mr. Crawford actually shared with me recently, the library started in 1894, and Mr. Crawford started the following year, right? So he can give you all some good background about the National Library of Jamaica. Our 40th anniversary celebration is actually under the theme, the dynamic legacy, celebrating 40 years with 40 projects. This concept was born out of the idea of hosting 40 signature projects showcasing the National Library's depth of value. We have planned an exciting lineup of year-long activities, and we crave your support and participation to make this a year to remember. Our official celebrations will actually begin on April 7th, where we will give praises to the Most High God at a church service of Thanksgiving at the Church of the Ascension. For those of you who don't know, that's on Daisy Avenue in Mona. And we have Canon Allen here, who is also on our board, and that's the church that he's responsible for. Other activities will include an island-wide tour. Find yourself at the NLJ. Most persons are, confusing the National Library of Jamaica with the Jamaica Library Service. So we're using this opportunity to let persons know they find themselves at the NLJ. So we're going to be known as the NLJ. And as I'm stating that, I'm seeing the Director General of the Jamaica Library Service, Mary Thompson. I just want to acknowledge your presence, Madam. So that's one of the activities we'll be having. We'll also be launching a book about 40 things you never knew about the National Library, and this is as it relates to national development. We're going to launch a film reggae portal, which will include the Reggae Film Archive, and also it will have biodata on the reggae pioneers in the UK. This October is the 15th anniversary of the Legal Deposit Act, so the entire month we have Mrs. Monique Farby-Scott. She's somewhere around in the registration area. She's the manager of collections department, and her team will be promoting the importance of depositing and donating any information you have about Jamaica or written or produced by Jamaicans. But in the interest of time, I will not list all the activities planned for the year, but will invite you to follow us on the various social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, at the NLJ for any updates. The NLJ, I always say, it's the authority in Jamaica's cultural conversation, and we are moving forward to realizing the vision of a new purpose-built National Library of Jamaica. This library will have cutting-edge library with adequate physical spaces for innovation and engagement in today's global digital age. We will continue raising the bar of cultural preservation and celebrating Jamaica's outstanding cultural heritage, abroad and abroad. Thank you all for being here today, and do enjoy the program.
And in fact, speaking of social media, just to let you know that we are in fact streaming live on YouTube, so let your friends know, those who can't be here. I think it was through Facebook, in fact, that I first encountered the National Library. Beautiful, beautiful old photographs of Jamaica they share on that platform. I can remember some of the Flatbridge and King Street, for instance. The Honourable Ministers you've heard cannot be here, and in her stead, Vivian Crawford will be giving some remarks. It was just on Friday, I was rebroadcasting, oh, you heard it? A 2012 interview I done with Mr. Crawford, so full of stories and anecdotes and history. I could have gone on for another 2 hours. Mr. Crawford.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Full of stories. I'm from deep rural, and there's another nomenclature for stories. Begins with the letter F. Madam Master of Ceremonies, Mrs. Dion Jackson Miller, members of the board of the National Library of Jamaica, including Miss Beverly Lashley, National Librarian, Canon Michael Allen, Dr. Paulette Carr, members of the Diplomatic and Consular Corps, including Her Excellency Laura Peters, High Commissioner of Canada to Jamaica, distinguished lecturer, Professor Deborah Thomas, and panelists, Ms. Pauline Llewellyn, Major General Anthony Anderson, Reverend Dr. Devon Dick, and moderator, Mrs. Dion Jackson Miller, guests including Professor Hilary Beckles, Professor Vereen Shepherd, Ms. Maureen Thompson, Ms. Binsom Hudson, First National Librarian, Dr. Susan Francis Brown, Mr. Wayne Chen, and Mr. Horace Levy. Members of staff of the National Library of Jamaica, members of the media, performers, ladies and gentlemen. Honorable Olivia Grange, Minister of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport, regrets very much that she is unable to be here and has requested that I represent her. It is my privilege, pleasure and duty to read the Minister's message. This year, the National Library celebrates its 40th anniversary and became what we now know as new nomenclature, the National Library of Jamaica, from the West India Reference Library, formerly a division of the Institute of Jamaica. Institute of Jamaica was established in 1879 for the encouragement of literature, science and art, and the National Library became an autonomous organization in 2010. This is the 7th staging of the National Library of Jamaica Distinguished Lecture and is the kickoff event for a year of celebrations. It is the aim of this Distinguished Lecture series to spark intellectual debate through scholarship that directly engages the national collection on topical issues, relevant issues facing Jamaican society. First staged in 2007, and the collection on topical issues include respected researchers and outstanding writers delivering talks on a range of subjects by bringing the best and brightest minds together in conversation to raise our gaze across the big picture issues facing our society. And we should share with you the sought after research material in the National Library, and that includes the original letter written by National Hero, Right Excellent George William Gordon, to his wife Lucy, explaining his innocence an hour before he was executed. Also, the submission for the national anthem of Jamaica, our independence, and the extensive collection of Archbishop Enos Nuttall. It was under Archbishop Enos Nuttall's watch, as chairman of the Schools Commission, that the paying of fees to elementary schools, now primary schools, was abolished based on lobbying by the Jamaica Union of Teachers, now Jamaica Teachers Association, led by Mr. W.F. Bailey of Mispa Primary School, Walterstown Post Office, Manchester, the father of social reformer Miss Amy Bailey. Over the years, the National Library has demonstrated its capacity as an able steward of the nation's treasure for the continued presentation of the distinguished lecture series. I therefore welcome, in a special way, distinguished lecturer, Professor Deborah Thomas, and panelists, Ms. Paula Llewellyn, Major General Anthony Anderson, and Reverend Dr. Devon Dick, moderated by Mrs. Dion Jackson Miller. Professor Thomas should be aware of a Jamaican connection with Pennsylvania, named after William Penn, whose father, with General Penn, captured Jamaica from the Spaniards. And William Penn prayed this famous prayer, which is still relevant today. God, help me not to condemn what I do not understand. This year's focus on contending with violent crime in our society is an urgent one. Crime in its various forms impacts the lives of Jamaicans. As the issues are complex and crucial, we do well by seeking to engage history in determining the way forward. Right Excellence Marcus Mosiah Garvey taught us, a people without the knowledge of past history, origin, and country is like a tree without roots. I commend the National Library of Jamaica for making a valuable contribution to the ongoing national discussion and wish for you all a never to be forgotten session, the Minister's presentation.
Linked closely, as a matter of fact, I would say intermingled with our own heritage and history is a drum, an instrument that speaks. Now, the Ancient Vibrations Drum Ensemble is led by Junior Gavin Wedderburn, not himself here, but his group is here for him. Mr. Wedderburn, well known to have recorded with a number of reggae artists as well. He has played with the Lion King on Broadway since it began in 1997, and his group presents traditional Afro-Jamaican rhythms and chants. He's also working on a project he's calling Bush Music, seeking to preserve traditional musical practices associated with Jamaican rituals, Afro-Jamaican rituals such as Kumino and Nyabingi. What better group to speak to us this afternoon as we commemorate our history, our heritage, than Ancient Vibrations? is wonderful to see so many of you here. Professor Deborah Thomas is the R. Jean Brownlee Professor of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. She's extremely well qualified to speak on this issue and has researched Jamaica considerably. Some of her many works include Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica, and Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Culture in Jamaica. She has also co-produced and co-directed 2 films, Bad Friday, Rastafari After Coral Gardens, and 4 Days in May. Can I ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Deborah Thomas to deliver the 40th anniversary lecture of the National Library of Jamaica, Memory, Archives, and the Price of Forgetting.
Good afternoon. Thank you for such a lovely introduction, and I want to thank especially the staff of the National Library of Jamaica, particularly Abigail Henry and Beverly Lashley, for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here with you today and to be part of this 40th anniversary celebration. I also want to thank the drummers and to express my apologies for Junior Wedderburn, who unfortunately could not be here, though he was planning to be. His father-in-law passed and he's had to travel to Grenada. And I also want to say that I tell my Caribbean class that story every time I teach it, in order that they have a sense that the Caribbean is not some place over there, but as a world that encompasses even the city that they're living in. So I appreciate that that the minister decided to raise that question. All right. The questions that I want to think through today are, what is the purpose of maintaining an archive, and what should archives produce? The bigger questions that frame these, of course, have to do with how the past lives in the present and what we can learn by attending to both the material and affective traces of our past. I'll say more about what I mean by affect in a minute, but I want to begin by talking about archives. Haitian anthropologist Michel Rouftriot gave us some of our most significant insights regarding archives, evidence, and the multiple uses of history, as they bear not only on social scientific research, but also on our day-to-day interactions. His work continually asked us to position archives not as static sources of information, but as dynamic spaces where knowledge is produced. His argument was that both the materiality of history and the interpretations of that materiality are constructed, and by this he meant to convince us that archives are mediated, not transparent, and that they're mediated by the particular historical conjunctures in which we find ourselves. Archiving, when understood in this way, produces silences and absences as well as presences. Trio's own work on the Haitian Revolution, for example, shows that it was quote-unquote unthinkable even while it was taking place. He minds letters written by planters in the French colony of Saint-Domingue to show that they could not apprehend that their black slaves were anything other than docile, tranquil, and obedient, and that they therefore were unable to conceptualize a scenario in which those enslaved persons could envision freedom or could organize collective action toward that goal. Why? Because of the dominance of a worldview that categorized its inhabitants according to the political, economic, and sociocultural logics and hierarchies of the plantation. Why is this important? Because it demonstrates the limitations of our historical consciousness. It shows that we filter our understanding of current events through the dominant frameworks of our time and place, which suggests that others in another time or rooted in another place might glean other important insights from the materials that we leave behind. One of the agendas of Caribbean studies has been to create archives in order to make claims about the significance of the region to the modern world and to the global processes that have shaped it over the past 5 centuries. Scholars have been inspired by historical, literary, and ethnographic evidence to generate arguments about the Caribbean's centrality to the development of mercantile and later industrial capitalism, to a system of racialized labor management and contemporary class and cultural stratifications, to ideologies and practices linking gendered and racialized subjectivities to patterns of state formation and imperialism, to the development of creatively creolized social and expressive cultural practices, to revolutions and social movements, and to contemporary processes of migration and transnationalism. Developing these kinds of archives helps us to understand why things are the way they are today, at the same time as it points us to new possibilities for organizing our political and social lives. Some scholars have also seen archive creation as a form of Black memory making within a context often characterized by an absence of ruins. This phrase, the title of Orlando Patterson's second novel, evokes experiences of rupture, pastlessness, and fragmentation, legacies of the transnational slave trade, that are often seen as constituting the historical and discursive context for the majority of New World African populations. 3 generations of historians and literary critics have attempted in different ways to reconstruct the lives of those who were or would become slaves, to glean insight into their aspirations, their imaginations, and their day-to-day movements by putting together a mention in a diary here, a list in a log there. These acts of reconstruction often stand in opposition to forms of state memory, and this is why they constitute a counter-archive, or what Tony Bogues has called a dread history. A dread history not only counters dominant assumptions about the region and the people who have inhabited it, but also provides the basis for claims about the relationship between present inequalities and past injustices. In this sense, counter-archives could be seen as forms of reparations. They vindicate us to ourselves, but perhaps more importantly to an external audience, one that is then called to make amends. This is an exceedingly important task, to be sure. However, my contention today is that this is not enough. I want to propose that we have a tendency to disavow the relationships among slavery, coloniality, and contemporary state violence, and that this disavowal has created a condition in which it is not only difficult to recognize the ways that the past lives in the present, but also to maintain a sense of common collective humanity. This is because we are not sufficiently and enduringly conscious of the terms on which this humanity, or lack thereof, has been based, the modern racializing assemblages rooted in New World plantation development, in which people were categorized as humans, Europeans, not quite humans, indigenous persons, and non-humans, slaves, otherwise property. My contention is that to access this consciousness, we must constantly enact forms of counter-narration that are supported by other kinds of archives, archives that produce affective recognition and reckoning. Now, when I say affect, I mean to evoke a collective feeling, a visceral resonance and expression of a historical and material reality. What W.E.B. Du Bois meant, for example, when in his magisterial The Souls of Black Folk, probed what it felt like to be a problem. These collective feelings circulate in particular ways at particular times, and they move through particular technologies. An archiving of affects is not quite the same thing as building a counter-archive. Rather than being oriented toward external audiences, archiving affects opens internal spaces of potentiality, those that might illuminate connections previously unexamined, or that might reorder the relations that we take for granted, like those between space and time, politics and justice, or the very terrain of humanism itself. Assembling archives of affect, thus, should tell us something about the sphere, something about how the sphere of the political has been imagined and felt at various moments, and about the kinds of politics that have been possible in those moments. In other words, it can give us a sense of how and why certain movements emerge when they do, and what the broader conditions are within and beyond Jamaica that either support or undermine them. Archives of affect can urge us to be more skeptical about nationalist narratives of perfectibility, whereby we triumph over past prejudices through a force of will and commitment to moral right. They encourage us instead to turn our vision to the messiness of sovereignty at different moments, and to audiences that extend beyond the juridical limitations of the nation-state, important within a context in which anti-colonialism has lost the radical edge of an earlier moment that was envisioned by both Africans and West Indians as a revolution that would transform and reconstitute the international order. Archives of affect can also shift the politics of reparations away from discretely local and legally verifiable events and toward the long and slow processes undermining our ability to forge social and political community together. At the same time, they can help us to focus on the everyday ways people innovate life without constantly projecting today's struggle into a future redemption. My argument today is that whatever else they might do, archives of affect should especially be used to cultivate a sense of mutuality that exposes the ways we are all implicated in contemporary socio-political processes and that demands collective accountability. My own engagement with archives has resulted from my interest in the afterlives of imperialism and in the forms of violence that have saturated this experience. The questions that have haunted me have had to do with what it means to be human politically in the wake of the plantation. How have people confronted the unpredictable aftermath of colonialism, slavery, and nationalism in ways that perform not only a material but an affective transformation? What forms of community and expectation are produced in and through violence? What does modern sovereignty feel like? These questions have directed my attention to the elaboration of post-independence cultural policy, to the disjunctures between this policy and the kinds of popular cultural production occurring at the grassroots level, to the various ways the state has violently circumscribed legitimate citizenship at different moments, both pre- and post-independence, and to the transnational entanglements that have had a hand in producing, circulating, and challenging this violence. While violence has been an intense preoccupation of many Caribbean states in the last 3 or 4 decades, developing archives of violence has not been straightforward, in part because violence tends to be transnational in scope, even if it is often analyzed as a national phenomenon. Archives of violence cannot be effectively rallied toward the projects of political and cultural nationalism, as so many other post-independence counter-archives are. Instead, they bring into relief the limits of the anti- and immediate post-colonial focus on the nation-state as the primary site of sovereignty and liberation, and they point us to the transnational geopolitical spheres that have produced not only international trafficking in drugs and arms, but also Ethiopianism, Pan-Africanism, and regionalism. It is also difficult sometimes to identify the audience for such archives, and thus the sorts of vindication that are sought after and the kinds of repair envisioned. For me, as an anthropologist, the archives developed as a result of ethnographic engagement can provide us with a different way to make forms of contemporary violence visible, and can give us a foundation from which to explore the historical roots of these forms. In my written work, I've been concerned to juxtapose assemblages of archives, visual, oral, historical, colonial, and post-colonial, in order to think through the relations they bring into being among the psychic, material, prophetic, and political dimensions of sovereignty, the broader geopolitical entanglements they make visible, and the possibilities they generate for a redefinition of human recognition. The visual work that I've done in collaboration with Junior Wedderburn and others has drawn extensively from the audiovisual archives held by the National Library in Jamaica, and we have benefited immensely over the years from the expertise of staff members Robert Simpson and Jason Smith. The sphere of the visual offers a different lens for analyzing violence in the afterlives of imperialism and for the development of affective resonances and recognitions. In our visual work, we're able to juxtapose divergent scales, perspectives, and times, and the affective engagements we've sought to reflect and generate through the production and editing decisions that we've made, as well as the dynamics of the present that condition these decisions, are sometimes difficult to capture or represent through words on the page. Our own location as diasporic Jamaicans, who who move across the political, social, discursive, and geographic boundaries that characterize our spheres, also creates both openings and barriers for the work that we're doing. Our two films, Bad Friday, Rastafari After Coral Gardens, and 4 Days in May, Kingston 2010, have thus attempted to bear witness, with all its complexities and complications, to dynamics regarding subjectivity, violence, and governance. Both projects stand as attempts to archive state violence and to give some sense of how the practices and performances of state sovereignty and the attempts to create life alongside, through, and in opposition to them have changed over time. Bad Friday concerns the 1963 Coral Gardens incident, that moment just after independence when the Jamaican government rounded up, jailed, and tortured hundreds of Rastafari in the wake of a land dispute that had resulted in the deaths of 2 policemen and 1 white Jamaican. This incident was largely forgotten by most Jamaicans outside of a handful of Rastafari activists in Western Jamaica and a few prominent spokespersons, and it was not reliably remembered among even Rastafari, especially the youth. In part, this is because the events at Coral Gardens would have been difficult to assimilate within a triumphalist nationalist narrative of ever-increasing freedoms and respect for Black political activism. To create the film, we worked with Junior Manning, who was at the time leader of the Coral Gardens Committee, and who had been struggling to bring national attention to the incident. Together, we tracked down elders who had experienced the persecution. We contextualized their narratives within the broader political and social dynamics of the time, such as a visceral fear of Rastafari and other forms of Black consciousness. Generating this archive had a number of effects. We first screened the film at the 2011 annual commemoration of the events at Coral Gardens to a rapt audience of Rastafari and fellow travelers. After that, the documentary had its official premiere at the Bob Marley Museum in Kingston, and it screened at film festivals internationally, on college campuses across North America and the Caribbean, and on public television here in Jamaica. I've also heard through the convoluted networks that embrace Rastafari, tourists, and other lovers of Jamaica, and through the diasporic channels that connect spaces within Brooklyn and the Bronx with media productions originating in Jamaica, that Bad Friday has screened on television in Germany, and that almost immediately after we released the film, bootleg copies were being sold in the bend-down plazas in Flatbush, which is great. The public defender at the time began to pursue a reparations case based on the incident, and the Western Extension campus of the University of the West Indies in Montego Bay developed a digital archive of Coral Gardens that includes our interviews as well as testimonies from additional police and civilians who were part of or who witnessed the events of that week. Bad Friday now runs on a constant loop in the National Gallery of Jamaica, the Institute of Jamaica's Western Branch in the Rastafari exhibit. And on April 4, 2017, Prime Minister Andrew Holness officially apologized to the Rastafari community and outlined a number of reparative benefits for those who were affected, including land and a trust fund, the distribution of which is currently being negotiated. An event that was all but lost to public consciousness has thus, within the past 5 years, become part of the national historical terrain, and we were happy to have been able to support these efforts in our own small way. The public attention to Coral Gardens was possible because the position of Rastafari vis-a-vis the Jamaican state is much changed since the early 1960s. Rastafari marked the limits of citizenship in the early days of independent Jamaica because they did not accept the authority of the Jamaican political leadership, did not subscribe to capitalist economic and social development models, and attempted to overturn normalized hierarchies of color and class. Now, however, Jamaica is known all over the world because of Rastafari and reggae music, and it's Rastafari that is largely responsible for the growth of Black pride and consciousness in Jamaica and elsewhere in the post-colonial world. It was possible to create this archive in the first decade of the 21st century, therefore, because Rastafari was no longer seen as a threat to citizenship and nationalist integrity. This is not as obviously the case when we turn our lens to the work we did in Tipley Gardens after the 2010 conversion. There, we endeavored to provide a platform for people in West Kingston to talk about their experiences during the week of May 24th and to publicly name and memorialize loved ones they lost. Working with a few key individuals within the community, we recorded about 30 oral histories in a friend's music studio. And we placed these narratives adjacent to historical archives, again from collections held by the library, of the process of destroying Back-O-Wall and constructing Tivoli Gardens, of the glory days of the community, and of newspaper headlines chronicling the history of political violence in Jamaica. We also used footage from news outlets in the United States, which, because of a Cold War interest in the Jamaican struggles of the 1970s, were reporting extensively on violence in downtown communities. We drew from footage from a US drone that was overhead during the operation, photography, both portraits of our interviewees and pictures taken by community youth during a workshop we ran with students from the University of Pennsylvania in August 2013. We had additional video from guided walks through the community in February 2012 and January 2014, and emails and cables between personnel within the US consulate in Kingston and their counterparts in Washington, D.C. On several occasions, we convened the people who shared their experiences with us to show them drafts of our work in order to receive feedback and to make sure we were walking that fine line that they asked us to when we began working with them. A line that reflects their negotiation of dual power structures, that of the state and that of the Dawn system. With 4 Days in May, we've been able to ask questions about how the techniques of visuality, which is not only about sight but also about knowing, and testimony, which is not only about narrative but also about sound, helps us to glean some insights into the themes that emerged within the narratives we recorded. A looping sense of temporality and racial reckoning, a difficult to parse relationship between surveillance and witnessing, a complex chain of political entanglements at multiple scales, a sense of trauma that is social rather than individual, and a profound perception of misrecognition. Our engagements in Tivoli have been stubbornly both unpredictable and intimate, and our visual work has sought to willfully accept this indeterminacy, while also attempting to awaken some sort of recognition of the domains in which we, as producers and consumers of events and their representations, are complicit. We have attempted, therefore, to work within a different ethical register, one that focuses on the quotidian expectations and experiences of social and political personhood within the garrison of Tivoli Gardens, and one that also creates a different kind of archive than that which is more generally publicly available on YouTube, for example. By this, I mean that most visual representations of garrison communities like Tivoli Gardens foreground the sensationalist dimensions of poverty and political violence, and they become a kind of ghetto porn. This dominant representation has had two important effects. The first is that the violence that occurs in these communities is seen as episodic and culturally rooted, rather than the result of structural and institutionalized political decisions taken over time. The second related effect is that many Kingstonians, and Jamaicans more generally, who do not live in downtown garrisons, have a difficult time imagining people who do as being fully human, and therefore possessing either individual and collective rights or an imagination for an alternative future. I am, of course, not alone in this observation. Political scientist Naziki Thame, for example, has argued that, quote, the post-colonial experience produces violence that in and of itself is related to processes of liberation, end quote. Her contention is that where, quote, middle-class and professional men came to assume power over the nation and have maintained their dominance over other weaker men and over women in general, the Caribbean state became an agent of this position. In this context, full personhood and citizenship remain in question for Black working-class Jamaicans, and working-class men in particular are criminalized, singled out for exceptional treatment by the state. Violence against poor working-class Jamaicans has thus become normalized, she writes, as a feature of elite consensus around a commitment to social order that dispossesses poor Black Jamaicans. The violence theme is pinpointing is not only the violence of party politics and racialized patterns of structural violence that have become normative throughout the Americas, but also in everyday violence that permeates poor Jamaicans' encounters with middle-class people, agents of the state, and each other. The garrison, for theme, is the extension of this violence and is, quote, a symbol of conquest and specifically of middle-class dominance over the poor through the party mechanism, one that seeps into every other dimension of social organization and interaction, locally and transnationally. The garrison is also a symbol that structures our imaginative frames, a phrase we commonly heard in the process of telling friends what we were doing, even those who had a long history of political progressivism, was there are no innocents in Tivoli, meaning that all Tivoli Gardens denizens are always already saturated by criminality, involved in ongoing political and turf wars. For those articulating this sentiment, the actions of the security forces during the May 2010 incursion were ultimately legitimate, if also examples of extrajudicial violence. For them, the other archives produced by the state during and in the wake of the Tivoli incursion, the de facto census of youth who eventually ended up at the National Arena, photographed, fingerprinted, named, and attached to a physical address, the so-called Book of the Dead, the online photo album of unidentified bodies in various states of decomposition that were perused at the police station by family members hoping to locate loved ones. These were necessary, both in terms of making a previously unruly landscape legible to the institutions of the state, and in relation to the need to identify and bring some kind of closure to the mass of civilians directly affected by the joint police-military action. As a response to these hegemonic forms of visuality, we took community residents out of the community and into a recording studio where photographer Varun Baker shot still portraits before we filmed their narratives. While Varun worked, he talked with community members, joked with them, asked about their families and hobbies. He recognized them, and here I mean recognition in the sense of truly seeing and identifying with them as fellow humans, and this relaxed them. The portraits, therefore, stand as an archive of people who are complexly engaged in a process of collective recovery, who are members of families and workspaces. This approach developed organically as a result of Varun's particular skills, and it stands in stark relief to an approach that might have positioned our interlocutors only as suffering and angry victims amidst the visual expectation of the noisy, gritty garrison. We also filmed against a stark white background in order to encourage viewers to focus on people's words and faces, to attempt to generate intimacy, acknowledgement, and recognition, to open a space for a more profound, if fleeting, intersubjectivity. Our intention was not, in other words, to generate trauma testimonies, but was instead to develop a dynamic affective space in which the trauma of exceptional violence was deeply contextualized at many levels of scale, and in which the entanglements among these different levels of scale remained open and unresolved questions rather than pat narratives. This intention also permeated the sound Junior created, both for the documentary and for the installation that's currently on view at the Penn Museum, and for the shorter experimental film that you may have seen before we got started today. In the soundtrack, we move between a sense of enclosure and trepidation and one of potentiality. The sound was designed to lead viewers through the events without necessarily satisfying a desire for or expectation of affective resolution, and to support the narratives without romanticizing them. I've outlined our intentions, but let me now turn to some responses which have been understandably different from what we experienced with Black Friday. Our first semi-public screening in Jamaica was at Grafton Studios, where we filmed people's narratives. This was a grassroots screening oriented toward people who were in the film and toward others accustomed to coming to Mikey Bennett's studio for his reasoning with seasoning. That evening, a moderator facilitated a wide-ranging post-film discussion in which many who were in the film came to the mic to elaborate on their on-screen narratives, adding back in the stories that I had edited out, saying more about other moments, talking about the lack of resources available for their extended trauma, one which did not begin with the incursion as it yet ended. A few who were not in the film, but were from the community, got up and shared their own experiences. People spoke about not being able to know or measure the long-term effects of what happened on children who were 8 or 9 at the time of the incursion who are now coming into adulthood. They discussed state violence, their term, as one of the legacies of colonialism and slavery. They asked why the music fraternity wasn't doing more in relation to Tivoli and wondered whether this was due to a concern about visas. And they talked about losing faith in the state. One young dread remembered that his baby mother was pregnant at the time, and they had been talking about whether the child should be born in Jamaica or in the US. After the incursion, because, as he said, all the patriotism he had for Jamaica was gone, he sent her to America to give birth. A former policeman who looked stricken throughout the screening said he thought everyone in Jamaica needed to see it. Grassroots screenings elsewhere in Jamaica have generated similar discussions, though with less visceral familiarity with the experience, and with more debate regarding the relationships between garrisons, dons, and political leaders. People tried, and sometimes succeeded, to put themselves in our interlocutor's shoes, and they questioned what they thought they already knew about the community. Among middle-class Jamaicans in Jamaica and in the diaspora, the response has been more disarticulated. Some, no matter their political persuasion, have been moved. In the UK, some have asked whether the film could become part of school curricula or whether they themselves could screen it in youth clubs. Those who were active on the left during the 1970s, on the other hand, have sometimes had a hard time with the film's humanizing dimension, feeling that we haven't done enough to explicitly lay out the parameters and participants of that generation-defining struggle. Indeed, anyone who lived through the 1970s has had a complex response to the events, landscapes, and moments the film parses, not least ourselves, and this response is a largely affective one. These responses should tell us something about the deep and long entanglements that created the conditions for the Tivoli incursion, entanglements that are the basis of a modernity whose origin is in the settling of the New World, and whose foundational infrastructures were therefore imperialism, colonization, genocide, and plantation-based slavery. Sylvia Wynter has argued that there is a tension between the dominant logic of the plantation, the logic that undergirds modern sovereignty projects, and its internal threat, spaces within which enslaved persons maintained a conception of themselves as human rather than property. It is this tension that has ultimately shaped the relationship between the national and the popular in struggles over sovereignty, and it is also this tension that becomes legible by ethnographically attending both to moments of exceptional violence and to the realm of everyday practice, by bearing witness, by quietly refusing the categories of the dominant, by assembling new archives. Archives can also be embodied in living, and let me use the song Ancient Vibrations played to talk about that as I begin to come to a close. The drummers sang Dry Bones in the Valley. They remembered when the wine was sharing, King Alpha and Omega were there. They comforted, singing, children in the valley are not alone. Bones in the valley shall rise and go home. Dry bones in the valley. Dry Bones tells the story of the prophet Ezekiel, who recounts a dream during which he found himself in a valley full of bones. The Lord told Ezekiel to prophesy over the bones, to tell them to hear the word of the Lord, to tell them the Lord would cause sinews and flesh to grow over them, and to cause the Spirit to enter them, so that they would know that he is the Lord. He continued, telling Ezekiel that he would breathe spirit into the bones of the slain persons, so they could get up from their graves and be restored as the people of God, the children of Israel, on the land that God had provided. Ezekiel's story is a vision of hope, liberation, and strength, the fulfillment of God's promise to his exiled people. Given this promise, it is not surprising that this prophecy, like so many others in the Old Testament, would have been adapted throughout the African diaspora as a central spiritual reference canonized in song. The traditional hymn reads, Dry bones in the valley, awake and ye shall live. Within African American spirituals, it's known as dry bones or dem bones, in which Ezekiel connects the shin bone to the knee bone to the thigh bone and the hip bone, and so on. The version you experienced earlier could equally be heard during an Ibingi or a revival meeting. Junior's adaptation includes these influences, but also brings in Kumina through lead singer Deborah Thomas from St. Thomas, and West African djembe drums. If we see West Kingston historically as a kind of crossroads of the people, as the place to which migrants to Kingston first came, the location where they adapted their rural worship practices to the new context, the space of various forms of leftist, nationalist, and black power mobilization prior to the construction of Tivoli Gardens and the solidification of garrison politics writ large, a politics that encourages Jamaicans to see residents of all garrison communities as always already criminal, inhuman, and unworthy of the normative protections of the state, then we might understand dry bones as a restoration of their humanity, an assertion within the living archive that the material, ideological, and sociocultural space of the plantation and its legacies cannot erase the sinews, flesh, and spirit of those whose positions within the contemporary political landscape is both the most fraught and the most precarious. In her consideration of Argentina during the Dirty War, the decade-long period of US-backed state terrorism in Argentina, during which military and security forces and right-wing death squads hunted down and killed or disappeared tens of thousands of people they labeled political dissidents, sociologist Avery Gordon argues that the middle class was forced out of fearful and fatalistic inertia by the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. In their weekly silent protests, these mothers shamed more privileged Argentines into doing something about the political terror that encompassed their lives. Gordon writes that middle-class consciousness, quote, always has something else on its mind: the bills, the errands, the car, the house, the petty tyrannies of administrators, colleagues, relatives, its seemingly absolute advantages and disadvantages. This is a class consciousness, she continues, that escapes real public civic life because it's tired or busy, or what can you do about it anyway? But, Gordon continues, when you know in a way you did not know before, then you have been notified of your involvement. You are already involved, implicated in one way or another. End quote. For her, this implication requires that something be done. It demands a reckoning with the way the past haunts the present. There are many here doing something. Organizations like the Peace Management Initiative and the Violence Prevention Alliance, JFLAG and its affiliates like We Change, Jamaicans for Justice, and of course individuals in every community who are organizing against police violence and corruption and against the idea that criminality is inherent to poverty. What affective archives of violence can produce is a different ethical stance, one that asks us to reckon with our past through attentive, embodied care, to recognize and respond to the psychic and socio-political dynamics in which we're complicit, and therefore to generate the ability to be responsible to ourselves and to others for the transformation of these dynamics. I want to leave you with two questions that may seem far afield from where we started in our reflections about archives, but that, in my opinion, should clearly emerge from them. In a context in which ZOSOs and states of emergency are no longer exceptional, and in which there no longer seems to be a viable alternative to neoliberal development strategies, what would it mean for middle-class people to imagine a reality in which the basis for our humanity is recognition by and through the garrison dweller? What other forms of political possibility might this bring into